It was a bright, cool afternoon in Boston, January 15th, 1919. People were going about their day near the waterfront, some unloading ships, others tending to horses or running errands. Children played on the cobblestone streets. Everything seemed ordinary. And then, without warning, came a sound, deep, metallic, like thunder trapped inside a barrel. A moment later, an unimaginable sight appeared. A wall of dark brown liquid, 25 feet high, was racing toward them. Not water, not mud, but molasses. In the next few minutes, an entire neighborhood would be torn apart by a tidal wave of syrup, so thick and so powerful that it crushed buildings, drowned horses, and suffocated people before they could even scream. This was the Great Molasses Flood of Boston, one of the strangest, deadliest, and most forgotten disasters in American history. To understand how something so absurd could happen, we have to look at the world of 1919. The First World War had just ended. Boston, like the rest of the United States, was transitioning from wartime production to peace. Factories that had once made weapons were now switching back to food and consumer goods. One company in particular, the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, had been booming during the war. They imported molasses from the Caribbean, used it to make industrial alcohol, and sold it to the military to produce explosives and ammunition. But after the armistice, that demand disappeared overnight. So the company turned its attention to producing alcohol for civilian use. There was just one catch. Prohibition was right around the corner. In early 1919, the U.S. Congress had just passed the 18th Amendment, banning alcohol nationwide. The Purity Distilling Company was in a hurry. They wanted to process and sell as much alcohol as possible before the law took effect. That's why, on Boston's Commercial Street, near the North End, they built an enormous molasses storage tank, 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, and capable of holding more than 2.3 million gallons of sticky syrup. It was one of the largest tanks of its kind ever built in the United States. It towered over the neighborhood, a dark, gleaming cylinder of metal surrounded by homes, shops, and stables. And yet, from the very beginning, there were warning signs. Residents said the tank groaned, creaked, and leaked constantly. Children from the neighborhood would bring cups and collect the drips of molasses that seeped from its seams. The company knew about the leaks and painted the tank brown to hide the stains. Workers had complained that it made popping noises at night, like gunfire. But management dismissed their concerns. They were racing against time, and every day mattered. In mid-January 1919, a fresh shipment of molasses arrived from Puerto Rico. Warm, dense, and heavier than the cold winter air. The company pumped it into the already nearly full tank. Inside, warm molasses mixed with cold molasses, creating expansion, pressure, and fermentation gases, all trapped inside a poorly built container that had been constructed without proper engineering tests or safety inspections. The result was a ticking time bomb. And on January 15th, 1919, at 12:30 in the afternoon, it finally exploded. The sound was so loud that people thought it was a bomb. Others thought a train had derailed or a gas main had blown up. But when they ran outside, they saw something no one could have imagined. A wave of molasses moving at over 35 miles per hour tore through the streets. Witnesses said it looked like a giant brown tsunami, 25 feet high and moving with terrifying speed. The waves smashed wooden houses like matchsticks. A massive steel support for the elevated train line was twisted and bent. A truck weighing several tons was lifted and thrown through the air. The force of the explosion was so great that it sent debris flying hundreds of feet. The first to be hit were the workers in the Purity Distilling Plant and firefighters from the nearby firehouse. The molasses crushed the building and trapped them inside. Others were caught on the streets, teamsters with their horses, children playing nearby, dock workers, and pedestrians. Many never had a chance. The molasses moved fast, but thickened quickly as it cooled in the winter air, turning into a sticky trap. People were literally glued to the ground, suffocating in the syrup. Rescuers said they could hear cries for help, muffled, desperate, but they couldn't move fast enough through the sludge to reach them. One firefighter, George Lacey, was trapped under the collapsed firehouse with several others. For hours, rescuers tried to dig them out. They could hear his voice fading. By the time they reached him, he was gone. In total, 21 people were killed and more than 150 were injured. Dozens of horses were drowned or crushed. It took weeks to find all the bodies. For Boston, the aftermath was like something out of a nightmare. The streets were dark brown, basements were flooded, debris was everywhere, twisted steel, shattered wood, broken wagons. The city smelled overwhelmingly sweet. The cleanup was brutal. Hundreds of volunteers, soldiers, sailors, and ordinary citizens arrived to help. They used shovels, mops, and buckets to scrape the molasses off buildings and pavement. Firemen sprayed seawater from the harbor to wash the streets. Even then, the stickiness spread. When workers tracked it onto sidewalks, it spread to homes, subways, and public buildings. For weeks, every surface in Boston seemed coated with a thin film of molasses. People joked that on hot days, you could still smell it. And some say that even decades later, the scent lingered in the North End. But while the cleanup was chaotic, the investigation that followed would reveal something much darker. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company immediately blamed anarchists. At the time, there was widespread fear of political radicals, especially Italian immigrants, many of whom lived in the North End. The company claimed that anti-government extremists had bombed the tank as an act of sabotage. It was a convenient story, but it didn't hold up. Within days, investigators began to uncover the truth. The tank had never been properly tested. There were no blueprints, no safety records, and no formal engineering review. When it was built in 1915, the foreman who supervised the project wasn't even an engineer, and the steel used was dangerously thin, about half the recommended thickness for holding that much liquid. In fact, during construction, one worker had asked for a basic stress test to fill the tank with water before adding molasses to check for leaks. Management refused, saying it would be too expensive and unnecessary. And the worst part? A company employee later admitted that the tank had leaked from day one, and that the company had simply painted over the cracks instead of fixing them. In other words, the disaster wasn't an act of sabotage. It was an act of negligence, a preventable tragedy caused by greed, haste, and arrogance. The victims' families filed lawsuits. It became one of the largest civil cases in Massachusetts history at the time. More than 100 lawsuits were filed against the company. For 5 long years, the case dragged on. The company's lawyers insisted the explosion had been caused by terrorists, but expert witnesses, engineers, and chemists proved that the tank had been structurally unsound from the beginning. It had failed because of metal fatigue and fermentation pressure inside the tank. In 1925, the court ruled in favor of the victims. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was found liable and ordered to pay $1 million in damages, roughly $17 million in today's money. Each victim's family received about $7,000, a modest sum for such devastation, but it was one of the first major corporate accountability rulings in U.S. history. More importantly, it changed the law. From that point on, cities and states across America began requiring formal engineering certification for large structures and tanks. Safety standards for construction were rewritten. In a strange way, the Great Molasses Flood helped make modern urban safety regulations possible. Yet, despite its impact, the event slowly faded from public memory. Maybe it was too bizarre to fit neatly into history books, or maybe people preferred to laugh at the absurdity rather than dwell on the horror. For decades, it became something of a local legend. The day molasses ran through the streets like a river, But for survivors, the memory was anything but funny. Many suffered trauma and injuries for the rest of their lives. One survivor, Maria D'Stasio, was only 10 years old when she was thrown by the wave and knocked unconscious. She later described the sound as like machine guns, the rivets popping one by one before the explosion. She never forgot the smell of molasses. Another rescuer said the scene looked like the end of the world, sticky, silent, and brown. Even weeks later, bodies were still being pulled from the debris. As time passed, the Great Molasses Flood became something of a metaphor, unchecked industrial ambition, for carelessness, and for how something so sweet could turn so deadly. Modern engineers have studied it in detail, fascinated by the physics. When the tank burst, the molasses' initial temperature was around 40 degrees Celsius, making it flow like water. But as it spread, it cooled rapidly, thickening almost instantly. This sudden change created what physicists now call a non-Newtonian flow, a fluid that changes behavior depending on pressure and temperature. It explains why the wave moved so fast and why victims couldn't escape once it cooled. Recent computer simulations have confirmed that the wave speed, around 35 miles per hour, was physically possible. It wasn't an exaggeration. It really did behave like a deadly brown tsunami. In the decades that followed, the site was rebuilt. Today it's home to a park, baseball fields, and offices. There's only a small plaque to mark what happened. Most Bostonians pass by every day without realizing they're standing where an entire neighborhood was once destroyed. But local historians have kept the memory alive. Each January, some residents still gather to tell the story, to remember those who died, and to remind everyone what happens when profit comes before safety. They say that on hot summer days, when the air is heavy and still, you can still catch a faint, sugary smell near the harbor. Maybe it's just a legend, or maybe it's history whispering back. Either way, the Great Molasses Flood stands as one of the most surreal chapters in American history. It's a story of arrogance, tragedy, and irony, when something meant for sweetness became a symbol of death, and it proves, once again, that the past is full of stories so strange that if they weren't true, no one would believe them. So, next time you pour syrup on your pancakes, remember, once upon a time, an entire city was buried in it. And for Boston, 1919 would forever be remembered as the year of the Great Molasses Flood. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because history isn't always dusty or boring. Sometimes it's sticky, shocking, and unforgettable.